5, 4, 3, ignition, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff.
Hi, I'm Bob, and today is a very happy day in my life. And thanks to the arrival of my new phone book from China, I get to create some art. This. The Winspace T1300 road bike frame. Now, I have had decades of experience as a professional prop maker for productions like the Star Trek franchise, as well as for other shows. And I make prototypes for collectible products and work on rare prop restorations. My work has been seen by audiences of millions, yet I am but a mere prop maker who never gets any credit, because credits go to prop masters and producers who have nothing to do with production, and huge phalanxes of digital artists, because we don't make movies by developing film anymore. We take the memory module out of the camera and stick it in a computer. So let's now go back, way back into the depths of the disco age when I was in high school. The year was 1977, when this certain little movie came out, and friends all over bragged how many times they saw it in the theater. And today they all complain on YouTube about how none of this franchise's sequels measure up to the originals. But what I did back then was almost as amazing. I built a bike frame in my school's metal shop class, using the instructions from the Proteus Frame Building Handbook, which was the first primer of any kind to describe constructing your own steel bike frame. My frame was equipped with Campagnolo Nuovo Record, and it was my primary road bike for over 35 years. And in 2008, I repainted it as a commemorative to my high school class, and I tagged it the class of 78. I continue to ride the most badass and bitchin' true 10-speed ever made by a kid, right up until the day it was stolen, never to be seen again. Today, however, I introduced my new Winspace T1300 all-around aero carbon frame, which I will be painting in much the same way that I painted my old steel frame, and making it a new commemorative for that old frame and including hints to its origins. This frame is size L and disc brake ready, with a BB86 bottom bracket shell, and it's one of several road frame models Winspace makes at their factory in Xiamen, China, home to quite a few of the carbon frame and wheel manufacturers of the Chinese bike industry. Winspace does OEM manufacturing for various bike brands around the world, as well as direct sales of their house brand for frames and their highly regarded wheels, and all at price points a lot less than the equivalent Western brands. But unlike other local builders, Winspace doesn't sell whole bikes, nor do they sell the generic open mold frames that abound on eBay and other sites. The T1300 frame is not the most advanced aero offering, to be sure. The design itself is a few years old. And indeed, at $1,180 at retail, it's the cheapest road frame they offer. But to be sure, it is a well-made frame made of the finest Japanese carbon cloth, and I'm sure when it is completed, it will be plenty aero and fast for me. It's not a budget grade, to be sure, and on the Winspace site you will not see any overpriced top-line models or identical second or third tier models made of lesser cloth. And for Winspace, all they sell is the T1300, a gravel frame, the lightweight climber SLC 2.0, and the T1500 True Aero frame. So why this frame for me? It's not the cheapest Chinese carbon by any stretch of the imagination, but in my opinion, Winspace makes the best and most consistent products where I won't have to worry so much about it failing like the stereotype that people often have about cheap Chinese products, which, if I'm to be strictly honest, is not without some degree of reason. And it's something that Winspace and other Far East manufacturers have spent years and expense to dispel. And I'm also a prop maker on a budget, and I'm not a dentist or a doctor or or a lawyer or anything like that. So something needlessly high-end like an S-Works or a Pinarello were never in consideration, and certainly not at the prices those frames are marked up to. I mean, I've looked at the Specialized website and I wonder what really is the difference between a laid-up in the Western Pacific SL7 with an S-Works decal on the down tube and the same frame with a Specialized decal, besides the $2,000 price difference. Perhaps a Specialized employee in the Morgan Hill headquarters could explain why the S-Works SL7 is priced like it's made out of pure latinum, while the Specialized SL7 is priced like the worthless gold dust pressings left over after the latinum is extracted. But anyway, enough controversy. Let's get started. I'm weighing the frame before I start. It weighs 1,075 grams, and the fork weighs 440 grams. Note that I ordered this frame without paint, so I wouldn't have to deal with a pre-existing paint finish, and I'm hoping my methods will allow the UD carbon base to show through the finish, which will be in a dark metallic candy blue base coat with an overlay of interference violet pearlescent airbrushed over it in a repeating Aztec pattern, much like the one used on the hull of the USS Enterprise from Star Trek The Motion Picture. When I repainted my original high school frame in 2008, I was doing it with the mindset that I would only do what was possible in the late 1970s, where the only real special effect vintage steel frames had back then were custom cut and chromed lugs. Indeed, I consider the painting of the Enterprise for the 1979 movie to be one of the greatest examples of the airbrushing art of the 20th century. And that was done using 4 interference pearlescent colors on a pure white base that gave it a iridescent color changing effect depending on how the light hits it. And it was about 20 years before true color changing pigments were made available. But here in the 21st century, I've come to realize that I have a modern frame and I shouldn't be limited by disco. I also know the frame I'm painting was not made by me, and in the long thought process of what the final art would look like, it went from identical to my old frame to a more modern two-tone fade kind of effect, and finally back to a near identical old look frame, but with its modern manufacturer proudly detailed in as a production paint job would be. So the frame is prepped like all frames should be, with wet sanding of the surface. I don't know if the frame had any sort of clear primer coat put on before it left the factory, but after sanding I sprayed it with a clear spray can adhesion promoter, which is the only clear primer that I know of. So after drying, I sprayed the base coat of blue, which after that dried is very dull looking. But in sunlight, it showed off the wavy random pattern of the UD carbon the frame was finished in, which is really kind of very cool and sexy looking. Meanwhile, during the long time between frame arrival and frame spraying, I took patterns off all of the tubing with blue masking tape secured to butcher paper, and I scanned it in so I could design and lay over the basic Aztec pattern the best way I could. I drew the base crab shape, made it repeat in lines, and I kind of went on from there, distorting the patterns to fit the tube shapes. And once I had all the patterns made and the elements from the Winspace decal art for my model extracted and sized to fit, along with a couple of interesting modifications to the logos and drawing up the Class of 78 commemorative decal art, I had it all cut out in masking vinyl. And now the fun part begins. And this next 6.5 minutes of warp speed effort represents several days of work. So enjoy! Okay, so along with the new frame, I also got the Winspace Zero integrated handlebars and stem, which at my first impression is really seriously stiff. And at $290 US, it's an ideal choice for modern bars without having to spend up to twice as much for a North American brand. But there was a slight problem. The frame came with 25mm of spacers for mounting, and after measuring my vintage Moser from axle to bars, I found I needed at least 25mm more. I value my back, so I wasn't going to slam the stem or make any real concessions to aero. So instead I decided to go in my own direction and make a spacer using prop making techniques. I started with an aluminum tube to fit the steerer, glued on a couple of foam pieces, shaped it as best as I could, then I wrapped the whole thing several layers thick in carbon impregnated with epoxy. I wrapped that in plastic wrap and I put it in the casting pressure tank at 80 psi and left it in there for a day. Then I milled the two ends to where they were flat and parallel to each other, and I capped both with thin sheets of carbon to its final size, which I ended up with 62mm. So after cutting the steerer on the bandsaw, I fitted it all on. And yes, the stem is well and truly slammed, and all on a single spacer. And I gained 12mm of height over the Moser's measurements, and it weighs less than the equivalent stack of aluminum spacers, which is not a bad thing at all. And it really kind of evokes the look of an old school quill stem. Okay, so all that clear coat you saw looked great a few minutes ago, but I had a problem. I ran out of paint. That one can of Spray Max 2K wasn't enough to properly clear coat all of a bike frame. I could have done it if I didn't have to have a fork or the other small parts, and I ended up with large areas that didn't get enough paint to make that wet, glossy surface. So as it is, I had to sand the frame with 600 grit to get the clear coat smooth enough for me to put more paint on. So after wet sanding the frame smooth, I found the shop had almost a whole gallon of 2K clear on hand, which was about 15 years old, like the blue cobalt base coat that I used. So I will also be clear coating with a different method. I'm using the touch-up air gun for the final coat. Okay, so I sprayed more clear coat on and was still having difficulty getting even coats underneath the tubing. So I've sanded everything to 1500 grit and polished the frame and fork with Novus No. 2 plastic polish, which I've always used for polishing parts and paint. And afterwards I wax it with turtle wax for that hard shell finish. TM. Now the Novus doesn't do the most mirror-like surface on paint, but it does provide for a really nice hand-rubbed finish that is, well, not only smoother than a baby's bare bum, but it also makes it not entirely wet like it's wet paint, but also not a really matte finish either. It's a nice in-between satin. So my verdict on the work: everything that I did was done to a very subtle effect and is meant to be seen in person up close for the full effect. The violet Aztec work is present, but probably not as heavily sprayed on as I would have liked. You know, the fork definitely got more of it than the frame did. But the effect of having that in combination with the candy blue base coat on top of raw carbon created an effect that, depending on how the light hits it, it completely disappears and the blue carbon really shines through. That sort of effect is very visible when you see the USS Enterprise modeled in Star Trek The Motion Picture, where all that airbrushing disappears in direct lighting. But thanks for me having a way more interesting base layer of UD carbon painted blue, it's on a frame that once again defies photography, and about the only other way you can get that sort of effect is if you're taking some magic mushrooms or something. So that's it for now. The frame and fork is painted and finished and put together as far as I can. The next thing is to get wheels and a group set, but that's for another video. So for right now, I have something I can hang on a wall and as the art it is. At least until the next happy day when this prop maker attempts to assemble a modern bike using the stone knives and bear skins I currently use for my old vintage bike. So for right now, the road adventure has yet to begin.
This is the future. Evolution. This is the future. Evolution.